weekend to you. Welcome to Leading Edge. I'm Jerry Anderson. Ahead of us today, the Iron Man of baseball broadcasters from right here in Toledo, about to call his amazing 6,000th game with the same team. But first, we have focused recently, last couple of months, on the city of Toledo's efforts to reduce violence. This after back-to-back record-setting years for murders. I'm afraid many of us see those numbers and we see only numbers. Or if we see people, we see only, I don't know, gang members, drug dealers, people who live, in certain parts of town. But I was struck that in the early part of this year, fully one half of the murders in Toledo were the result of domestic violence. And folks, that one cuts across all socioeconomic lines. It exists where you live. I don't care where it is. It exists there. Deidra Lashley, executive director of Bethany House, the only long-term domestic violence shelter in town. Sadly, those numbers don't really surprise you, do they?
It's a sad state of affairs at this point with the rate of domestic violence homicides that we're looking at. Just since September, we've had 10 fatalities in Northwest Ohio that are related to domestic violence. But that is kind of what we're seeing across the board. We know for the state, we've seen a 62% increase in domestic violence fatalities since COVID. So unfortunately, our area is not immune to this, and we're looking at similar stats.
62%. Well, let's go there, because the problem of domestic violence, boy, that figure, that's stunning. But yeah, it has been, and you and I talked about this a bit. It's been exacerbated by the pandemic. And yet I found this interesting, didn't see this coming. The easing of pandemic restrictions, which we've all been longing for so long and stuff, is causing its own problems, isn't it, in this area of domestic violence? Can you explain that to myself and to our viewers?
Yeah, that's kind of our guess, is this trend of increased fatalities in the last 6 to 8 months locally could be due to the fact that victims have been locked down. They've been locked down with their abusers and trapped at home. And we know that that's been a very scary time. And now that some of the restrictions are lifting, people are getting out and reaching out for help. They may be thinking about leaving that abusive partner now that there's access to some supports and resources. And we know that that is the most dangerous time for domestic violence victims, is when they're making that leap and they're taking those steps to leave. That is when people are ending up being killed or hurt very badly, is when they're trying to leave. And so that is our kind of interpretation of what's happening, is now that all the COVID restrictions are getting a little looser and people are thinking about making those steps, it's getting very dangerous for victims. 75 times more likely to be murdered when you're leaving that abuser than when you're staying. So it's a very dangerous time.
Okay, which leads us into a couple of things. I was going to get this later in our interview, but let's go ahead and jump there now, because there is legislation, you tell me, down in Columbus, and it's on bail reform, which many people say is long overdue if we're going to try to address some of the inequities, racial and otherwise, in the arena of criminal justice. But as written, you tell me, judges, am I following this right? They must, on misdemeanor cases, they must release somebody within the first 72 hours after being charged. And that is the exact time, if I'm reading you right, Deidra, that's the most dangerous time for this. So that has to cause concern for you.
It's causing tremendous concern for advocates across the state that this legislation is moving forward without an exception for domestic violence offenders. Bail reform is desperately needed. We all realize that, but we have to have some language in there that would allow judges to assess the dangerousness of this person to their victim, who is known. So this is not just a random act of violence. This is a targeted act of violence against someone that, may have called the police for the first time and gotten help. And now they have 72 hours to figure it out before they know that person's going to be back at the doorstep.
Yeah. City of Toledo recently announced that it was going to beef up efforts to battle domestic violence, especially in the arena of criminal justice. What do we know about that at this point?
Well, it's wonderful to hear their commitment that they're adding a prosecutor, they're adding clerks for the municipal court offices. And it's wonderful progress, but I'm hopeful that they'll continue to evaluate the workload and the burnout level of those folks that are working in that arena, because those are very strenuous cases, very stressful, and the most dangerous cases that they're dealing with at municipal court. And so they need probably more than even what they anticipate at this
You
point.
say they're adding a detective, which is this true? That would double the manpower in that arena. I mean, again, not being ungrateful, but adding it's adding 1 to 1. And have they given you the assurance? I'll make sure I'm clear on this. Have they given you the assurance that they're going to monitor the situation? Because I believe you've indicated to me you welcome that, because once they monitor it, they will see the proof in front of them that our response is still far from adequate.
Yes, exactly. 2 detectives is better than 1.
Sure.
But for the number 1 call, domestic violence is the number 1 call that TPD receives. I'm concerned that 2 is still not enough to really handle that caseload of victims and pursuing warrants and whatnot.
All right. Your what do you call it? Shelter there at Bethany House? Is that the word that's used? Okay. And it is,
Yes.
we mentioned earlier, the only long-term transitional care center in Ohio, or in the Toledo area, in Toledo. What is your capacity, and how often are you at capacity?
We are at capacity year-round. We are constantly full with a waiting list. We have an apartment model. So we have an apartment building, 16 apartment units dedicated to domestic violence survivors and their children. They can stay with us for 1 year to 2 years to start putting pieces of their life back together, heal from injuries, emotionally start to heal, and financially begin to recover from what they've gone through.
I think of the YWCA in there. You say, well, the difference is they're the emergency shelter. They're the very first phase, right? I mean, somebody needs help, needs it right now. And then that gets them into, and then over that longer term, that's where Bethany House comes in. And I know folks are going to wonder, well, who pays for the Bethany House? I know you have, and I've met some of them, very generous donors. And yet you tell me that up to half of your resources have come from grants, be they state grants, federal grants, and those federal monies in recent years began to recede when we have this huge demand. Tell me about that.
Yeah, we've been asked to do more with less. Our number 1 federal fund that covers our expenses is the Voca Grant, which stands for Victims of Crime Act, which is a fund federally that is built up from criminals, mostly corporations, white collar crime, that are paying fines into this victim fund that is then dispersed to victim programs across the country. And that fund, unfortunately, has not been taken care of at the federal level, I'll say. And so victim programs across the country, not just Bethany House, but all of us, at the same time have been facing 30 and 40% cuts year after year after year. And that's for most of us our largest funder. So it's wait a
minute, Deidra, who made that decision? At a time we have these needs, why are we cutting?
Well, it's because the fund is being depleted and the fines are not being, they're being diverted into other spending. So thankfully there was a Voca fix that passed through the legislation last year. And so we're hopeful that things are going to begin shifting, but to replenish it in times to prevent further cuts, it's going to take time.
Wow.
So again, we're looking at probably another 2 years. Mm-hmm.
Want to point out, folks, I hope you heard that in there. Those are not tax dollars. Those are fines, fees from some bad actors that are being then repurposed into, we hope, productive and protective measures. Let's wrap. If we know somebody that we fear, we haven't seen it personally, but we see signs and we hear things. If we know of somebody we fear is in an abusive relationship, what should we do? I mean, some people are going to say, well, what if I'm wrong? I would never live it. What if he what if he then extends his anger and comes after me? What should somebody do?
Yeah. I know in those situations, the stakes go really high. None of us would ever want to put somebody in increased danger or, accuse someone of something when we're not positive. And I would suggest, reaching out to them, just letting them know what you are seeing and that you're concerned, that you can be a confidential support to them, that whatever they need, if there's resources that can be provided, there's just phone numbers that you can provide to someone like the YWCA 24-hour hotline, the national hotline is available. People can chat confidentially with advocates. And that's probably the biggest thing, like I was saying earlier, that leaving and trying to leave and get out from an abusive situation is the most dangerous time. And so connecting them to an advocate that can help them safety plan, help them know their resources and prepare can really help to prevent further escalation and further violence.
My thanks to Deidra Lashley for keeping us on the leading edge of the efforts to fight domestic violence while protecting its victims locally. We're back with the Hall of Fame voice of the Toledo Mud Hens, who's right on the cusp of an unbelievable milestone, next on Leading Edge.